Those of you that are taking this course for credit, I've handed you a copy of the final review. There are some things in life that are a walk in the park. This does not fit in that category. Okay? So it's not impossible. It's not unfair. There's nothing on there that we will have not discussed. But don't think you're going to slide in there and spend a couple minutes and rip that thing apart. You'll be the one to be ripped. Okay? And make sure you do your reading and your questions in advance, because there's going to be a question on there. Did you do the reading that was assigned, and did you answer the questions? Let me read some of these that you've turned in. I ask you to list 10 things that we learn about God from the book of Daniel. Number 1, God can reveal secrets, chapter 2 and verse 28. Number 2, God changes the times and the seasons, chapter 2 and verse 21. His works are truth, His ways are just, chapter 4:37. God rules in the kingdom of men, 5:21. He's the living God and steadfast forever, 6:26. He delivers and rescues, 6:37. He works signs and wonders in heaven and earth, 6:27. He's righteous in all His works, 9:14. No one can stop Him. No one can question what He does. No one is higher than Him, 4:35. And finally, He holds our life's breath in His hand. I think you could do some really good work with that material right there. Here's another one. 10 things I learned about God from the book of Daniel. He knows the future completely and entirely, chapter 2, 28 to 45. He knows and can reveal all that a man has in his heart, even things the man himself does not know, chapter 2 and verse 5. He rules in the kingdoms of men, giving them to whomsoever He chooses, chapter 2, verse 20 and 21. He can cause His servants to succeed and triumph even in a sinful and hostile environment, chapter 2 and chapter 6. He's neither restricted nor bound by the laws or decrees of men, chapter 3 and chapter 6. He loves His faithful servants and loves them greatly. Chapter 10, 11, and 19, we read that Daniel is beloved, right? Number 7, He causes things to happen at their appointed times. That's a great observation. Chapter 11, 29, and 12, 9. He reveals His will so that men can understand it. Chapter 9, 2, and 22. He knows what is good for man to live on this earth. Chapter 1, 12 to 15. And finally, He does not fail those who put their trust in Him. Chapter 3, 16 to 27. Again, I think you could use that quite easily for material. Okay? I'm not going to read all of these, and so if I don't read yours, please don't be offended. And if I read yours and I don't give your name, please don't be offended. Just get over it, okay? I didn't know somebody wrote in Chinese. 10 things we learn from the book of Daniel. God rules and controls events in the lives of people in order to fulfill His will. Chapter 1 and verse 9. As an individual, we must make our own choices to obey God's law in order to get His blessings. Chapter 1 and verse 8. God gives knowledge and skill. Chapter 1, 17. He answers prayers, 2:18 and 23. God knows the future in the latter days, 2:28. He sets up kingdoms and gives it to whomever He chooses, 4:32. He keeps His word, 4:27. He's a jealous God of men worshiping gods of silver, gold, bronze, and iron, which do not see or hear or know, 5:23. We must follow His law and not the law of men, chapter 6 and verse 5. And we should be known to people around us that we follow God's laws by our deeds and our words, chapter 6 and verse 16. I appreciate your work on this, and those of you, if I didn't read it, if you stay around afterwards for 17 seconds, I'll go ahead and read it and give those back to you so you have access to them. Open your booklet, if you would, to the questions on chapter 10, and open your Bible to chapter 11. You know, we noted together when you get to chapter 7, it's like stepping into a new phase of this message. Because before you get to chapter 7, you read about Daniel interpreting someone else's dreams, right? But in chapter 7, it's Daniel who's given the visions. And you see that vision there in chapter 7 of 4 beasts that come up out of the sea, and the vision of the Ancient of Days, and the vision of one like the Son of Man going to the Ancient of Days. And you see this aspect in chapter 7 of the kingdom is given to the saints. And so it's fascinating to read this message in pictures. And then in chapter 9, which we covered partially 2 weeks ago, and Brother Lewis helped you finish that study last week, chapter 9 is an amazing message about the Messiah and something that was called 70 weeks. And then in chapter 10, in my estimation, one of the key thoughts is revealed to Daniel, and it's in our Bibles in verse 14. And the message to Daniel was, from God's messenger, "Now I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people in the latter days. For yet the vision is for many days," meaning this refers to many days yet to come. But that seems to me in that context to be a key concept. You know, Daniel had been concerned. He'd expressed his concern to God for God to be merciful to His people, to be merciful to His city. And so some things are revealed to Daniel about the future of his people. Well, who would be Daniel's people? The Jews. Okay? Things pertaining to the Jews. You said, well, when I read chapter 11, it's not like I'm reading about the Jews did this and the Jews did that. Well, in chapter 11, what we're going to see is a focus on some of the rulers who would have had an influence on the Jewish culture. Okay? And so, look at your questions on chapter 10. We'll hit a couple of these. Number one, Daniel received a message during the 3rd year of Cyrus's reign. Fill in the blank. Cyrus was a ruler of the blank empire. Medo-Persian, absolutely. You see how well we work together? If only we could do the final reviews together. Just not to be. So, what does that tell us about how long Daniel was in captivity? Yeah, the entire 70 years that they were there, okay? So what would we conclude then about how long he worked as a prophet? Around 70 years. That's a pretty extensive ministry, isn't it? About 70 years. Okay, number 2. How long was Daniel mourning in the setting that's described there in chapter 10? For 3 weeks' time, okay? True or false? The Tigris or Hiddekel River is named as one of the 4 rivers which came forth from the Garden of Eden. That's true. And you know, when we started our introductory lesson in this book, we talked about being able to identify where the original civilization of mankind was based on the location of the Tigris. Number 4, a messenger of God called Daniel a man what? Greatly beloved. Now, do you take that to mean A, beloved by humans, B, beloved by God, or perhaps a combination, C, of the two? Loved by God, I think, is your main thought. But among those who love God, would he also not be a beloved person? Daniel was of such a character. I don't mean he was a real character. I mean his steadfast character in serving the Lord was widely recognized in his generation. When Ezekiel was giving his message to those Jews who are in captivity, at one point God gave this message through Ezekiel. God said if there were 3 men standing here to appeal on behalf of the Jews, He said they couldn't save these people. They could only save themselves by their righteousness. And God named 3 individuals who are well known to Bible students. Anybody want to take a guess? Noah, Daniel, and Job. Okay? So, again, that shows us in God's estimation the type of person Daniel was. That's Ezekiel 14, verses 14 and 20. Number 5, the essence of what the Lord's messenger told Daniel had to do with what would happen to whom? The Jews in what period of time? The latter days. Now, you can study it. But my conclusion is, in this context, the latter days is not speaking about what sometimes in the Bible is called the period of the last days, but simply a later period of time from the moment that it was spoken. In other words, here's what's going to happen in the future of the Jews. Okay? In this instance, and I don't know what your discussion concluded last week, but in this instance, the latter days appears to refer to what? Into the Mosaic dispensation. And I added for myself, perhaps down as far as the destruction of Jerusalem. In God's plan, the law of Moses no longer was in effect from what occasion? From the cross, or if you think about Pentecost, in that time frame. Now, to the unbelieving Jews, what did they continue to do up until the time of the destruction of Jerusalem? They continued to act as if the law of Moses is enforced, and they continued to make those sacrifices, okay? And went to the temple for worship, right? Number 6, name a couple of things a messenger called on Daniel to do. Don't what? Don't fear, and what's the other? And I think that's connected with that message of verse 14. I'm telling you things that are out here in the future for your people. One of the things we've seen in the book of Daniel is, who's ruling in the kingdoms of men? God is. And there were instances in history, even in Daniel's life, where some may have concluded, man, it looks like the heathen are in control of things. It looks like Satan's got the upper hand. No. Daniel recognized what? It's God's going to make this thing work out. And so the appeal was, don't be afraid and be strong. The final question on the next page, Daniel was told his prince was whom? Michael. Okay, his prince was Michael. Now, chapter 11 is an extensive chapter. And as I study this chapter, I rely heavily on historical data that has been recorded in secular sources. And I am grateful for those who, before my birth or since my birth, have done the investigation into the history and have graciously shared that historical study with the rest of us. Now, sometimes you got to pay for it. Sometimes you got to buy their books. But if you look at the overview we've got on chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, prophecies about the Medo-Persians. Think with me for a moment, y'all. Back in chapter 2, this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, and Daniel explains this image. How many earthly kingdoms were symbolized in that one image? 4 earthly kingdoms. And in order, they played out how historically? In order. Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Romans. Now, I don't think there's 25 questions on the final that talks about that, but there's probably a couple. In chapter 7, those 4 beasties, those 4 beasts come up out of the water there. Lion, bear, leopard, and a really unique beast. They symbolize 4 kingdoms. And in order, those 4 kingdoms were, what's the old saying? Second verse, same as the first. Okay? So that's what you see. In some chapters of the book of Daniel, there may be more of a focus on 1 or 2 of those kingdoms. It doesn't mean the others were irrelevant. For example, in chapter 8, 2 different critters. In chapter 8, you've got a ram and a male goat. And the wonderful thing about that is we don't have to fantasize. We don't have to Google it to find out which empires those 2 critters symbolize. Because we're told right there in chapter 8 and verse 20 that ram symbolized which empire? I've not heard a wrong answer yet. Medo-Persian, that's right. And the male goat that came up and smashed that old ram symbolized which empire? And that horn that came out symbolized the first king, which would be Alexander the Great. So in chapter 8, the spotlight, so to speak, is on those 2 kingdoms. Now, in chapter 11, where was I? I was on my overview, right? Who distracted me? Right. Verses 3 and 4 will be about Alexander the Great and his successors. 5 through 20, the relations and conflicts between the king of the south and the king of the north. Okay? Well, we'll see what that means in the context. It's not talking, let me just tell you this in advance. The king of the south here is not talking about a king of the northern kingdom of Israel. The north is not the kingdom of Israel, and the south is not the kingdom of Judah. Chapter 11, 21 to 35 will be reintroduced to a man about whom we read. Remember back in chapter 8, we read about this little horn, right? And we saw this little horn. He's going to take away the daily sacrifice, and he's not going to allow the Jews to circumcise their children, and he's going to do all these horrible things. And that's this fellow whom the Jews called the madman. And then the final section, activities and conquest of the king of the south. Look with me in our booklet on page 48, under the prophecies about the Medo-Persians. Number 1, the message of this verse, that is chapter 11 and verse 1, goes with the final segment of chapter 10. It's a continuation of what God's messenger told Daniel about what would happen to the Jews in the latter days. Okay? Now, let's read verse 2. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet. Hold on just a minute. You see in verse 1 there's a reference to whom? Darius. Yeah, Darius the Mede, whom we think was a sub-ruler under whom? Cyrus. Okay? So that would be the beginning point of the Medo-Persians. They overthrew the Babylonians. Well, Cyrus died in about 530 or 529. And so when you read in verse 2, 3 kings in Persia is starting in about 530 BC. And the 4th, who's mentioned in verse 2, he's going to be what in comparison to the others? He's going to be richer. And by his strength, he's going to go over and stir up the Greeks. Well, that is a person identified in history as Xerxes. Okay? We've got that in our booklet on page 49, about in the middle of the page on Arabic number 4, subpoint number 2. The 4th king who would fight against Greece would be Xerxes, the first known in the Bible as whom? Ahasuerus, who was married to Esther. Okay? So there's that connection. Again, look, historical. This is an amazing chapter because it speaks about real historical figures, real historical events, and it's given in enormous detail. Okay? Now, verse 3 says, a mighty king shall stand up. Hold on just a second. Hold on. When I come to the end of verse 2, let's, maybe historical dates are not your thing. But as I come to the end of verse 2, And the reign of this fellow we're identifying as Xerxes. What's my historical date? I'll do the hard part. BC. 485. We've got that in our booklet. Okay? Just think out loud with me. 485. Now then in verse 3, a mighty king is going to stand up that's going to rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And after him, his kingdom is going to be broken, divided to 4 winds. Now, we read earlier about someone who's going to be king, and after his death, there would be 4 of his generals who eventually the kingdom would be divided among them. Who was that great king? Alexander the Great. Now, here's my question. You remember what we just said at the end of verse 2? We're talking about BC 465-ish. What about the rule of Alexander? When did that begin? Go back in our booklet on, it's chapter 2, back on page number 12. Pretty close. The Greek Empire there. The kingdom symbolized, if you can locate number 3, the Greek Empire started in BC what? 333. That'd be Alexander the Great. So what we're saying is, it appears in our text in chapter 11, we go in verse 2 from 465, in the very next verse, about how many years later? Ballpark figure. How many years later, math folks? 130 years. Okay? I'm not making a big deal out of that, but I'm making a deal out of it just so you'll see that sometimes in the Bible what we have as a verse, and we might think that next action took place the very same day or the next day or maybe a week later, this one was 130 years later. Okay? And so again in verse 4 you've got that idea of the kingdom being spread. Now, go back in our booklets to where we were in chapter 11. I want to read something with you on page 48. You say, don't you mean 49? No, actually I mean 48. Look at Arabic number 2 there. This entire chapter foretells events that will take place after Daniel departed from the world. What do you call that when God, through a prophet, foretells events that are going to take place later on? What do you call that? Prophecy. Okay. The prophecy, if you look at small number 2 under that, this prophecy covers events that would transpire between about BC 530 and BC 164. What's 164? The death of Antiochus Epiphanes. So in other words, you've got in this chapter at least that period of time. Again, you do the math, it's over how many years? It's over 300 years, right? During this period of time. All right, now then. Starting in verse 5, we're going to see a reference to someone called the King of the South. And then we're going to read in verse 6, the King of the North. How do we go about identifying in this context? I'm not talking about what you read in Acts chapter 14. I'm not talking about Exodus 24. I'm talking about in this chapter. How do you go about identifying the King of the South? Well, you look down and what you're going to see, and look, we're not going into this in detail tonight, but you got out of those 4 divisions of Alexander's kingdom, when it was divided up among 4 of his leaders, they were in different locations. And in this chapter, Daniel's going to zero in on 2 of those, one called the north, one called the south. The south, verse 5, is going to be Egypt. And I see that word in verse number 8. And historical indications are that they often, in our language, were at odds with one another. Okay? Well, in this case, if the south is in reference to Egypt, verse 6, the king of the north, verse 11 is the king of the south and the king of the north fighting. Whom do we suppose the north might be? Yeah, I think so. That's right. Look in our booklet, and we've kind of identified. You're right, exactly right. Page 49 of our booklet. Major black point number 2, subpoint number 2, after Alexander's death, no one personally rose to power, and those places are listed, and Seleucus is listed as Syria in the region of the east and Ptolemy in Egypt. So this chapter over and over is talking about what's going on with Syria and Egypt. Now, a modern-day resident of Hamilton County, or Walker County, or Catoosa County might shrug their shoulders and say, well, why do the Jews care about that junk? Well, in terms of, if I may say, Bible geography, where were the Jews and Jerusalem located in relationship to Syria and Egypt? Answer? That's exactly what you're going to say. Smack dab, same generation, brother right there. Smack dab in between. And so if the Syrians wanted to fight with the Egyptians, or the Egyptians wanted to go up and fight with the Syrians, whose land would they pass through? The Jews. And they also had their eye on, hey, wouldn't it be nice if Jerusalem belonged to us? And so they were caught in between. And so what was going on with them could affect the Jews. Now, it's interesting history. There were times when they fought with each other, and as ancients often did, and as some modern leaders do, maybe their daughter would marry somebody in that other king's family, and so for a while they're not fighting until it's time for the inheritance, right? They're at peace. And so there's this going back and forth. Now, drop down and look at verse 21, and verse 21 going to verse 35, and perhaps onward, is a reference again to that fellow known as Antiochus Epiphanes. And the Jews called him what? The madman. Look at our booklet on page 50. We'll read a little bit, and then we'll take a look at some things in the text. Number 4 on page 50. Subpoint number 1, Epiphanes. That word, I think, in their language meant glorious or illustrious. Well, he certainly was neither of those. He was a Greek king over the Seleucid Empire from BC 175 to 164. You say, well, it's only 11 years. How bad could it be? Bad. Real bad. And we talked before about, some of the things that he did. He was known as a vile person, verse 21. He was known as he was a, what's our word? He was a deceiver. He was a conniver. He was, may I use the word? A politician. Who was looking out after whose interest? His own. Okay. And so whatever he needed to do to weave his way into somebody's good standing, he'd do it. And once he got in power, he was ruthless. Okay? He was ruthless. He dealt deceitfully. Okay, but again, in our booklet, if you look there on subpoint number 2 under 4, he was a vile person of intrigues or flatteries who worked deceitfully. We already noted that he well fits the description of the little horn that would grow out of the Greek Empire. Go back to chapter 8. I don't think I did that justice as we discussed that night. Chapter 8. Verse 9, this little horn, and again, the context in chapter 8, the little horn, 100%, absolutely, certainly, is connected with which empire in chapter 8? Greeks, okay? The Greek Empire. So the little horn comes out of it. What's he do? Well, look at verse 10. He magnifies himself even to or as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. What daily sacrifice? The Jews. He compelled, on the one hand, he compelled the Jews to stop their daily sacrifices at the temple, and on the other hand, he tried to compel them to serve what? Idols. And he brought in a swine and offered it there. Okay? Verse 12, and a host was given him against or to oppose the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, cast down the truth to the ground and practice it, and so on. So we think This is the same individual described in chapter 11. Now, did all the Jews go along with that? No. Some, disappointingly, some compromised. Look in our Bibles in chapter 11. Chapter 11. Again in verse 31, and about the middle of the verse is the idea of shall take away the daily sacrifice. And they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Evidently in verse 32 the thought is some of the Jews would compromise and go against God's covenant. On the other hand, there would be some who did know God who would be strong, verse 33, and they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity, and by spoil many days. Some people are going to put their lives on the line, okay, for what they believed in. Verse 34. And when they shall fall, they shall be holpen or helped with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. Now, in our booklet, we've made an observation. Look on page 50. It's Arabic 3, subpoint number 1. Based on verse 32, some of the Jews under the influence of Antiochus would do wickedly against God's covenant. On the other, some would be strong. Look down at subpoint 3 there. Here's a man named Judas. What's he commonly called in history? Judas what? Maccabeus. It's in the preceding paragraph under number 2. There was a period that's known as the Maccabean period. We sometimes call it that period of time as the time between what? What do we mean when we say that? The time between the Testaments. Yes, between the last revelation of God in the Old Testament in the days of Malachi, which was probably around 400 to 430 BC, the end of his revelation from God, until the time of the coming of the New Testament instruction. So we call that the time between the periods. And one of the names among the Jews that we commonly read in that history is the Maccabees. And so Judas Maccabeus was one who helped the Jews cleanse the temple and overcome some of those atrocities that were carried out by Epiphanes. Okay? Now, look in chapter 11 and verse 35. And some of them of understanding shall fall to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end. Because it is yet for a time appointed. That is appointed by God. Here's a terminology. The time of the end. And we'll see that language more than once in this final section. Remember, the language is about what's going to befall Daniel's people in the latter days or the latter times. The time of the end in this context is not talking about the end of the world. It is not talking about the end of the world. It's talking about the fulfillment of the time that how God's going to deal with these different empires and how God's going to deal with His people. Now, look, if you would, in our booklet on page number 52. I want to look at these questions with you. And I have an inside source. Just take it for what it's worth. I have an inside source that says that any reviews passed out on the book of Daniel, every one of those questions on chapter 11 is going to be on that review. Hint, hint. Okay? Number 1, this chapter's prophecy points to events that are going to transpire between what dates? 530 and 164. At least to 164. Okay? Now, let me say this as you're marching through that. In the final section of chapter 11, which is challenging, What do you suppose our premillennial neighbors conclude about that section? It talks about a king of the north, beginning in about verse 36. The king. Has anybody ever heard of this or read it? They often conclude it's talking about some future ruler who will be opposed to the cause of Jesus, whom they label as the what? Antichrist. Listen. Whatever you say about Daniel 11, whatever you say about Genesis 1, whatever you say about Acts 2, cannot contradict other clear passages of Scripture. In history, has there been anyone on earth who could have been labeled as an Antichrist in history? Yeah, in the New Testament, first century, there were many. Anyone who denied the deity of Jesus, who was an enemy of the cross, they're labeled as a what? And the world is full of Antichrists today. The kingdom was established in the first century. I feel better, okay? Number 2. The king of Persia, who's called the fourth, who would go and fight against the Greeks, usually is identified as Xerxes. You say, was his spelling count? I can get your point. You can get it across, okay? Xerxes. Xerxes. Who in the Bible is called Ahasuerus, however you pronounce it. Esther's husband. Number 3. The mighty king who would rise up would be Alexander the Great. Fantastic. I don't mean he's great. I mean fantastic. We give the right answer. Number 4. Much is said in this chapter about the king of the south, king of the north. In this context, king of the south is? Okay, thankfully we didn't say Robert E. Lee, right? Okay. Egypt. And the king of Syria? Up. I could have said it's a long day. Today's the same length as every other day, y'all. Number 5, who's that vile person? Antiochus Epiphanes, yeah. And I think some even label him as the fourth. Yeah. The madman, right? The Jews called him the madman, and you understand why. You know, as I read this whole chapter, I'm reminded of our need in dealing with people to be people of compassion. A part of us may look at what the Jews endured and say, y'all just need to suck it up. Well, that's easy to say when we're the ones who are not being persecuted. It's not our family members, our nieces and nephews or grandchildren who are being taken off and slaughtered. It reminds me to be compassionate when we don't really understand what people are going through. Number 6, name a person between the Testaments who tried to lead the Jews in resisting the evil done. Maccabees. And we mentioned this at some point. I don't remember what chapter it was. But the Jews, when they were able to cleanse the temple and restore the worship in the days of Judas, they started a new feast in celebration. What was that called? Feast of Dedication. Feast of Dedication. That's mentioned in John chapter 10. I'll tell you what, just for quickness sake, what do you got in chapter 11, 36 to the end of the chapter? You have reference to the king. And I think he's even called the king of the north. I'll tell you what would happen. If you were to just continue reading, the natural reading would be to say, well, it's been talking about Epiphanes. It sounds like it's still Epiphanes. And you know what? That might be right. I'm not 100% convinced. It's not the Antichrist. It's not Herod the Great. Could it be connected with the Roman Empire? It possibly could be. You do some study on that. Now look at chapter 12. We'll just take a brief amount of time. Look at chapter 12, our overview on page 53 of our booklet. A continuation of the words from God's messenger about the future of Daniel's people. And then 2 messengers speak, and then Daniel asks the meaning. Does that sound to you like it was possible for a prophet to proclaim something and not completely comprehend the complete fulfillment? Yeah, in fact, we have that in the New Testament, right? In 1 Peter 1, what is it, verses 10 to 12? He said, the prophets, they wanted to know what this meant. They were mouthpieces, but didn't totally understand. I think Peter was in that same category. On the day of Pentecost, Peter declared the promises unto you and to your children, and as many as are far off, even as many as the Lord our God shall call. He proclaimed that the message of salvation and blessing from God was for the Jews and Gentiles. Did he practice it immediately? No, he didn't comprehend it. His message was true, but I don't think he got it there in the beginning. Okay? Look at chapter 12 and verse 1. It's really it's a meaty verse. And sometimes I don't do well with meat. I stick with veggies, okay? But you look at verse 1. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. So look, Michael was going to stand up and be on whose side? God's people. And was speaking to Daniel, your people, the Jews. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time, thy people shall be delivered, everyone that shall be found written in the book. So whatever is going to play out, the comforting message to Daniel is there's going to be a time when your people are going to need to be delivered. Are they going to be delivered? Yeah. Now that doesn't mean it's going to be painless. Doesn't mean it's going to be persecutionless. But God, for the good of His people, He's going to deliver them. And the message is the trouble they're going to endure, what about that trouble? Going to be bad. Bad to what extent? In our language, we sometimes say that. We're talking about, well, maybe somebody gets to bragging about their granddaughter or grandson. Or somebody talks about something they've seen, and they say, you've never seen anything like it. It's a language we use to emphasize what? Really something special. Now, does that language sound familiar with anything that the Master said? Look in your Bible in Matthew 24. And I want you to hold your place in Matthew 24 because we're going to grab something else here in a minute from Daniel 12. In Matthew 24, in response to the apostles' statement, basically, wow, isn't that temple amazing? Jesus said, well, there's coming a time when there won't be two rocks standing on top of each other in this temple. In other words, what's going to happen to the temple? It's coming down. And it's going to happen in that generation because verse 34 says, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Well, in that connection, verse 16, if you're in Judea, run to the mountains and all that stuff. Look at verse 21. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. He's talking about the extensive persecution and turmoil at what occasion? Destruction of Jerusalem and the capture of the city before that time. Now, hold Matthew 24 open and zip by Daniel 12 for a moment and go to Ezekiel chapter 5. If it's not 5, it's 6. We'll find it. Ezekiel 5. I want you to see this language in the prophets. I'm going to go 2 minutes over, and so I'll owe you 2 minutes next term, okay? I didn't hear anybody say okay. Okay. Chapter 5 of Ezekiel. Verse 5 talks about, says, this is Jerusalem. Now drop down to verse 8. Therefore thus saith the Lord God, behold, I, even I, am against thee, and will execute judgments in the midst of thee in the sight of the nations. Here's what God's going to do to Jerusalem, verse 9. And I will do in thee that which I have not done. I've never done this before. and whereunto I will not do any more like the like. I've never done it before, and I'll never do it again because of all your abominations. What was God saying about what He's going to do with Jerusalem? You're going to destroy it. You've never seen anything like it. That's talking about 586 BC. Daniel chapter 12, talking about something like you've never seen, is not talking about 586 BC. That already happened. So just think about that. One more thing, look in Daniel 12, and then your ears will be at rest. Look in Daniel 12. I'm looking for the time of desolation. Look at verse 8. And I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, Daniel, O my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And you drop down to verse 11, and here it is. From the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away. Well, that could have been in the time of Epiphanes. It could be in the time of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And what else? The abomination that maketh desolate. Jesus picked up that language, the abomination that makes desolation. Look in Matthew 24 again. Verse 15, Jesus' message to the apostles. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. When you see that stand in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. He says, when you see that abomination of desolation, verse 16, what do you need to do? Leave. Now, here's Luke 21 and verse 20 that gives us some assistance in understanding. Luke 21 and verse 20's message is, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you run to the hills. So that somehow, Jesus applied that to the destruction of Jerusalem and what the Romans did to the temple. You have been a fabulous class. If there's been a weakness in the class, I know who's responsible for that. I've enjoyed every minute. And I hope that this study's done what we're trying to do with all these classes. And that is help you understand some things and whet your appetite for further study. That's what you need. Further study to dig in deeper.